researches and writings, has spearheaded the research in critical philosophy of race. Again, I must mention some foundational texts published by Professor Bernasconi that include Race and Racism in Continental Philosophy with Sybil Cook in 2003, Race, Hybridity and Miscegenation, which was published in 2005, and several others which provided us interpretations of the works of Ottobacco Guano, Frederick Douglass, Antonin Fermat, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, and many others. Professor Bernasconi is also the founding editor of the journal Critical Philosophy of Race, which hosted a special issue, a double issue on caste and racism in India, in which many of us contributed, and which was also the beginning of this initiative of critical philosophy of caste and race. But in addition, Professor Bernasconi edits the Levinas Studies and the journal Ecoethica. Over these past 3 decades, this vast body of work in the field of critical philosophy of race, we can also see the formation that he defines as an attempt to put philosophy to work to assist in the fight against racism by rendering racism more visible and more intelligible. And in these 2 ways, I think philosophy lives again, even though one of the prominent gestures of philosophy in the last 20th century, was to declare its death. Philosophy as a way of acting in the world, this is a phrase I have often heard from Professor Bernasconi, and I think he embodies this definition. But the second, also philosophy as a historical body of disturbing promotions of and contributions to race theory, which means philosophy must question its own history. And I think critical philosophy of caste and race is inspired by these 2 aspects of philosophy that were defined by him. I would also like, in closing, to quote Charles Mills, who has said very memorable words about the style and methodology of Professor Bernasconi's work, his relentless scrutiny of philosophy's history, which Charles Mill described, led him to describe Professor Bernasconi, and I quote, as someone who unnervingly not merely knows the primary text and in multiple languages, but also the unpublished writings, the draft versions, the students' lectures and notes, the laundry lists, this reminds us of Nietzsche, and the state of contemporaneous discussion of all these matters and more in the obscure and unfindable journals of the time. And so it's once again an honor to have Professor Bernasconi address us on no less a topic than the possible futures of the very field that he founded and helped to co-found. And I now request Robert to please give his lecture.
Thank you very much, Divya. I'm honored and delighted to be a part of this meeting. I'm only sorry that I couldn't be with you on this occasion. If I sound a little hoarse and seem to be lacking in energy, I'm literally just waking up. But I think you realize by the time I get to the end of my talk that waking up to what is happening in the world today is really what we have to do. I'm glad that Divya mentioned this particular volume of critical philosophy of race that she edited with essays by Oishi Fumio, Emma Dickens, Yashpal, Bilband, who I know are part of this meeting. This has been one of the journal's most successful issues, and I learned a great deal from the contributors. So I'm very eager to retain these links between what we're doing in North America and what is now happening with the initiative in the critical philosophy of caste and race in India. Of course, there is in the background of any discussion of caste and race, and casteism and racism, the question of how distinct they are as forms of oppression. Today, we're trying to establish that this cannot be decided on the basis of the question of whether caste discrimination functions like racial discrimination. Indeed, I would argue that in the context in which we find ourselves today, the whole dynamic of how we think about what we are doing, and indeed what we must do, is changing as we speak. The conference, the architecture of inequality, is a perfect venue for the things I want to say, because in the announcement of your conference, you asked us to focus on social inequalities in terms of structures and systems, rather than on individual biases alone. And this is where my own work in critical philosophy of race is headed. And even though the basis on which I can talk about the Indian caste system is obviously severely limited, and I will try to keep away from it as much as I can, for fear of showing my ignorance, I can at least offer some reflections about why the issue of systemic racism has proved such a challenging issue in the United States. I think we can contrast that with the way that Dr. Ambedkar always saw caste very much as a... I think critical philosophers of race in North America have much to learn from activists in India, both about caste, but also, and what is especially germane here, about casteism as a system. It's possible that some of you have looked at critical philosophy of race as it's practiced in the United States and been disappointed. I often find myself sharing that disappointment, but I want to try to explain some of its deficiencies as a way of opening the question of its possible futures. One of the things that has been disappointing to me is that from the outset, critical philosophy of race was supposed to be, at least on my understanding, global. And that is what it needs to be. It can't be simply based in North America with the discourses of North American racism dominating it. And this is why I think that issue that Professor Divya Dwivedi edited has been so important for us. But it's disappointing, secondly, because many critical philosophers of race in North America seem unwilling to engage with the idea of systemic racism in any rigorous sense. So I want to start by talking about some of the reasons why I think that is the case. First, one must not underestimate the extraordinary degree to which North Americans in general, and that includes North American philosophers, embrace individualism. That conforms to a country that understands itself as in some way formed on the basis of a social contract. Methodologically, for them, one is an individual first and a member of society only subsequently. And this plays a considerable role in a certain refusal to take any responsibility for what was already in place before one was born, even if one is the beneficiary of past crimes. A second reason why systemic racism has not been developed so much in the United States as perhaps it should have been comes from the very word racism. You have to remember that the word racism only gained currency in the late 1930s, and it was used at that time primarily to discuss Nazi anti-Semitism rather than the forms of prejudice and discrimination within the very fabric of the United States in the way African Americans were treated, and equally the way colonialism as a system treated the colonized populations. Somehow that origin in the idea of individual prejudices directed against people like the Jews, who, particularly in Germany in the early 1930s, were, I should say rather in the 1920s, were castigated largely because they were seen as running the country, not because they were seen as at the lower end of the hierarchy. That, of course, changed for the Nazis when they developed another form of anti-Semitism against East European Jews. But I feel that this notion of racism has never fully moved away from its origins in discrimination by individuals against other individuals, to the neglect of the institutional, structural, and systemic forms of racism that sustain and dominate the individual forms of racism. The third reason that I think that we have been remiss as critical philosophers of race in developing adequate notions of systemic racism lies in the resources that were available to us when 20 years ago critical philosophy of race took off by name. I don't want in any way to diminish what critical philosophy of race has accomplished. It has had, as Professor Dwivedi was saying, a significant impact on the way philosophy is being taught now in North America. The clearest evidence of this is the number of positions that have been advertised and filled in critical philosophy of race in major universities. But the resources that were available to many philosophers in that area were limited when it came to thinking systemically. One has to think that one of the great resources for critical philosophy of race at the beginning was the writings of African American philosophers. Academic philosophy in the United States had largely been silent about race, at very least since the Second World War. In doing so, it was following the lead of the UNESCO Statement of Race of 1950 that itself was shaped by the writings of Franz Boas and Huxley and Haddon in the 1930s. They had restricted the term race to a biological conception that, because it was of very little use to biologists, could be easily renounced. And that was the approach, for example, of Ashley Montagu, a representative of popular science, who helped to formulate the UNESCO Statement on Race of 1950. But this approach found its way into philosophy through Anthony Appier's famous 1986 essay, The Uncompleted Argument, Du Bois and the Illusion of Race. This was in large measure a discussion of Du Bois's 1886 lecture, The Conversation of 1896 lecture, The Conversation of Races, which was, and Appiah framed it by a discussion of what biologists were saying about race. And this meant that a large part of the discussion in critical philosophy of race has, unfortunately, this may go back to the very title, Critical Philosophy of Race, it's been too much focused, I think, on the notion of race rather than on the fight against racism. Appiah barely mentions racism in his essay. It only appears twice, I think, and then only in passing. But the implication seemed to be, and certainly this was a widespread view in North America at that time, and perhaps still now, was that if discrimination against someone on account of their race, if that's what racism is, and if there are no races, then racism is simply an epistemological error. It can be refuted by education. It's not embedded in the materiality of the world. And I think this set off critical philosophy of race, at least in some of its components, in the wrong direction, because it did nothing to illuminate the formation and perpetuation of slavery, colonialism, and forms of segregation in North America and elsewhere, even to the present day. It neglects the fact, this approach, that past racism is now embedded in the very fabric of the world, its laws, the distribution of wealth, the distribution of education and health resources, and so on. In short, all the things that a simplistic version of meritocracy ignores. Now, a change came about in critical philosophy of race, or I should say proto-critical philosophy of race, critical philosophy of race before the name was born, when in 1997, my good friend Charles Mills opened up another route. This was with the publication of his book, The Racial Contract. Mills's work, which I suspect many of you know, was in Marxism. But the racial contract sought to meet mainstream philosophers somewhat on their own turf, which in the United States, due to the influence of John Rawls, meant social contract theory and the philosophy of Kant. And this is what led Charles Mills, shortly before his death in, I think it was September 2021, to advocate for what he called black radical Kantianism. I often talk to Charles about this. I always thought that he perhaps tried too hard to focus on bringing the dominant philosophers around to his view. Whereas where he was clearly having the most impact was elsewhere. We would often discuss this, and to my mind, even though the notion of system is gestured towards in his book, the method of philosophizing that he uses perhaps is too dominated by a style ill-suited to address those systemic issues. The second main resource available to critical philosophers of race, which I think was to a large extent underused, although was used by many people, was critical race theory. 15 years ago, when critical philosophy of race was finding its voice in the journal and elsewhere, critical race theory had already developed to a much more sophisticated level, especially if one thinks of figures like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. But as with African American philosophy, critical race theory, by its very nature, was called upon to focus on the North American context, to neglect the global system. Critical race theory belongs in legal studies. That's where it had its source, and it's out of that it developed. But legal studies is by its very nature national, because the laws, the dominant laws, there is of course international law, but the dominant laws are the product of an individual nation and have to be understood in that way. So although critical race theory contributed greatly with notions of whiteness, of intersectionality, and indeed with the notion of systemic racism, about which it talks extensively, critical philosophy of race perhaps didn't sufficiently develop those resources that it gave us. And I think one reason for this is the dominance of analytical philosophy in the United States. Obviously, not everything in analytical philosophy functions by way of analysis, but that is very much part of its methodology. And analysis, by its very nature, breaks things apart, but is ill-equipped to put them back together. So analysis separates. It's analysis which takes the individual out of their context, abstracts them from their context, and loses sight of the whole. And yet when we talk about systemic racism, what we're talking about is indeed the whole, the totality. And it's with that I want to turn to the third main source for critical philosophy of race, which I think has proved to be the most productive, particularly in relation to this issue of systemic racism. I'm, of course, talking about the impact in the United States of the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon. Fanon's 1952 book, Black Skin, White Masks, and especially its fifth chapter, which was entitled The Lived Experience of the Black, encouraged an existentialist approach to race. The chapter began with Fanon's description, it is presented as autobiographical, of the devastating impact that a child calling him by a racial slur on a train in France had on him. The chapter follows the series of reflections. It sets him off on the various blind alleys that he explores as he looks to a way to address this kind of individual racism. It ends with the damning judgment. I began to weep. I began to weep. Now, in that chapter, Fanon certainly castigates Sartre, and particularly Sartre's essay, Black Orpheus, because Sartre there invited, or appeared to invite, Black people to adopt a philosophy of history in which Black people would renounce their Blackness on the way to a new humanism. Now, I don't intend to go into the intricacies of that argument here, or the extent to which Fanon ultimately seemed to object to Fanon, not because he disagreed with him on that point, but rather because he thought it was not right that a white person should say that. But what I want to follow up on is the way that Fanon's account authorized within philosophical writings in the United States, numerous similar autobiographical accounts of the lived experience of racism. These accounts had also been inspired, of course, by Jean-Paul Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew, with its claim that through the gaze, the anti-Semite makes the Jew. It seemed, at least through this path, philosophers could leave behind the abstractions of academic philosophy and speak concretely from their own experience. It authorized a new way of thinking and writing about race. And it was an approach which was not only better suited for a more global audience, that each from their own specific context could write about their lived experience without having to pay abeyance to the dominant philosophical fashions and styles of philosophizing. But it also, and this is what is important for me in this context, it led to the most rigorous, I think, account of systemic racism that we have. The point is this: Chapter 5, The Lived Experience of the Black, is not Fanon's last word on racism. It was only when you pass from the 5th chapter to the 6th chapter, the Negro and Psychopathology, that the seeds of what one could call Fanon's traumatic encounter with the child could be seen to have been sown much, much earlier, even before he went to France, while he was still in Martinique. Fanon was saying racism is not primarily rooted in that individual encounter that he had described. The effect of the child calling him by a racial slur, all that had been set up while he was still in Martinique, while he was listening to watching Western films, reading about French history, listening to children's stories, and so on. In other words, Fanon's meltdown had been triggered by the effects of what he called cultural imposition. And so by moving to cultural imposition, Fanon had broadened the view of racism away from individual encounters, individual discrimination, to the culture which set up those individual encounters. And by 1956, in his essay, Racism and Culture, he was already presenting racism as a disposition fitting into a well-defined system. And of course, that in 1961 gave rise to the account of colonialism in The Wretched of the Earth. Sartre was on a similar trajectory. In 1956, he had written the essay, Colonialism is a System. And in 1960, he had published The Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he insisted that systemic racism cannot be reduced to an account of the kinds of statistical correlations that one finds in sociology to establish the existence of systemic racism. Statistics that show that, for example, that African Americans are more often stopped by the police when they're driving their cars than the rest of the population. That provides prima facie evidence of structural and systemic racism, but it doesn't help us comprehend it. It doesn't render it intelligible. It doesn't show the depth of its operation. And this is what Sartre and Fanon were trying to do in their works that were written so long ago and which we're now, only now, beginning to fully appreciate and build on ourselves. Past action, they say, has become fixed into the material structures of the world. And it's only by way of moving the camera lens out, as it were, to see the totality that one can, through action, comprehend the concrete situation from which one started in one's account of lived experience. Now, when one talks about the whole and about the totality, two new considerations come into play. The first is that when we talk about systemic racism, we cannot talk about it in isolation from, for example, sexism, ableism, or other forms of oppression. That was what Fanon was already saying in 1956 when I quoted him as describing racism as a disposition fitting into a well-defined system. To talk about systemic racism in isolation from sexism, ableism, and these other forms of oppression retains the abstraction. It's just, even though in certain contexts, systemic racism might be the dominant form of oppression, it cannot be treated in isolation. The second aspect is, of course, the global one. One mustn't just move back historically, which is what Sartre focused on perhaps primarily in the critique of dialectical reason, that one has to see how the history of any country has established the destinies of the people living there long before they're born. And indeed, that is the very nature of racism and casteism. But we have to move outwards, thinking globally. We have to understand that we are complicit. And when I say we there, I'm thinking primarily of people who, like myself, live in rich countries. We're complicit, not just through our knowledge, but through the very nature of international trade and restrictions on immigration and so on. We've reached a time and place in which we understand everything we do impacts all others. Isolationism is not an option. And I think this is what Professor Dwivedi was telling us in her article in the 2013 issue of Critical Philosophy of Race, when she was saying one cannot combat racism without combating caste. And of course, it's equally true. One cannot combat casteism without combating racism. So Sartre and Fanon introduced a paradigm shift that seemed to have, at the time, more impact on activists than on academics. I'm thinking of the Black Panthers, people like Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, and of course, Steve Biko in South Africa. They had made the point that racism cannot be reduced to the prejudice and biases of individuals, that it belongs to the material system. It was a lesson, in fact, that Hegel had already taught us in the philosophy of history, when he said, well, you cannot understand the need for the Reformation in the corruption of the church by just thinking of it as abuses of church authority. It was the system, he doesn't use that word there, but that's what he's talking about, that was corrupt. And we have the same problem in our own countries when incidents of racism or casteism are reduced to, for example, by the police. They're reduced to, certainly this is the phrase used in the United States, to rotten apples. It has to be seen as systemic. And this is the resources for doing so in a developed way is what Sartre and Fanon helped provide us with. The sense in which racism is located in things. The definitions of racism tend to focus on discrimination by individuals. It can even be extended to discrimination by institutions or collectives. But those definitions still do not capture the sense in which racism is in things, in the material reality that one finds oneself thrown into at birth and one has to engage with at every moment until one's death, especially if one is a member of an oppressed group. In other words, we're talking about the system. Now, as I said earlier, I think casteism has been historically more readily understood as a system, by which I mean a material system, not the hierarchical classificatory system that sociologists and anthropologists like Louis Dumont talk about. Casteism has been seen more as this material system than racism has been seen, say, in North America. But it's interesting how we also, in North America and elsewhere, can understand slavery as a system, a material system, and apartheid as a material system. It's as if what defeats us in North America is the lack of a name to describe what happened with the end of legalized segregation. One of the candidates for naming this has, of course, been the phrase white supremacy. For example, Francis Lee Ashley, the critical race theorist, describes white supremacy as a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, and where relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Now, what in part, for me, recommends this name, white supremacy, as a title for what we're still dealing with here in the United States, is that that was the name that John Van Every, the New York publisher and author, selected when he was promoting white supremacy in his book published in 1868 under the title White Supremacy and Negro Subordination. What he was suggesting in that book was that slavery was the proper condition for Black people in the United States, but that if slavery was to be abolished, and of course it had been in 1865, it had to be reinstated under another name. there's an important book called Slavery Under Another Name to describe the convict lease system. That is indeed what happened in the United States after the abolition of slavery. And that was the name he chose. But you might be interested to hear that, in fact, so far as I'm aware, the first use of the phrase white supremacy was in a discussion of India. A man called Major Henry Bevan in 1839 wrote a book called 30 Years in India. This is what he wrote. The security of our empire in the East would be greatly strengthened if the Hindus could be brought to regard us as their fellow subjects, not as their masters or conquerors, and our functionaries would abandon or at least conceal those notions of white supremacy which are frequently absurd and always offensive. So Major Bevan was attacking the idea of white supremacy, but it seemed that the most he could hope for was that the colonial administrators would conceal their notion of white supremacy, not abandon it. In any case, returning to that decisive period in American history after slavery was abolished, I find it interesting that it was the term caste that many of the most prominent activists embraced in trying to challenge the system of white supremacy. I'm thinking particularly of Charles Sumner. You may have heard of Charles Sumner because in 1856, 2 days after he'd given a speech against the slave power, he was beaten to unconsciousness on the floor of the Senate in Washington, D.C. by a man called Preston Brooks. But I'm interested in Sumner because in 1869, he published this book, The Question of Caste, where he drew a clear parallel between what he called the dreadful Indian class system and slavery in the United States. And indeed, he traced race distinctions back to the caste system in ancient India. Now, there is much to question in Sumner's book. He'd been convinced by some European observers that caste distinctions were becoming less salient in India. But he was clear that even in its mildest form, the Indian caste system was evil and had to be opposed. Similarly, one thinks of Catherine Impey, who in 1888 began a publication in England called Anti-Caste. But perhaps most significant for our discussion at this conference is how in 1873, Mahatma Jyotirao Phule, in his book Slavery, or Gulamgiri, drew on the history of slavery in the United States for his radical critique of the Indian caste system. So it seems that toward the end of the 19th century, at this decisive time, the parallel between systemic racism in the United States and the caste system in India was clear to activists in both places. And my point today is that the same can happen again. Now, that is the note, a hopeful note perhaps, that I would like to be able to end this talk. But I cannot, for that is only one possible future for critical philosophy of race. There is another future that we are facing, when we talk about systemic racism as philosophers in the United States. And that arises from a campaign against this very concept, which has been led by politicians since January 2021, which, if you're not aware of, I think you should be aware of. Since that time, in at least 44 states, attempts to restrict critical race theory have been proposed. These are proposals designed to control how issues pertaining to racism are taught in schools. In 18 of those states, those measures have been passed into law. And while it is often unclear what is forbidden to teach in schools, and has probably been left deliberately vague as a form of intimidation, systemic racism, the very concept, is often mentioned in this regard. Now, for the most part, though not exclusively, these measures have been labeled against high schools, but they are increasingly being directed against universities. And just as universities in Florida have had to submit their syllabi for scrutiny to see if they in any way offend the administration's, the Republican administration's views about Israel, it is quite likely that similar measures could be taken with regard to the teaching of race and racism in the United States as well. Because those measures, the bills in the 18 states and so on, those took place before Trump took office. Since he took office, on January the 29th, just this year, under the title Ending Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling, that's schooling for people up to the age of 17 to 18, to receive public funding, one has to engage in what is called patriotic education. And among the characteristics of patriotic education is that one offers, as they call it, a clear examination of how the United States has admirably grown closer to its noble principles through its history. This would be a surprising judgment if it was to be made on historical grounds. But what is clear is that under the name ending indoctrination, they are mandating a form of indoctrination, which they do also in vague terms with their dictation, by dictating on the part of teachers a commitment to America's aspirations, which they call beneficial and justified. That measure was preceded by 2 days by another one under the title Restoring America's Fighting Force. That executive order prohibits the United States service academies from teaching, for example, that the America's founding documents are racist or sexist. It's forbidden to teach those things. These academies amongst the most selective undergraduate colleges in the United States. One would have thought in those places that such matters would at least be open to debate, but they're no longer open to debate. Again, a new form of indoctrination. And the latest, it appeared only 3 days ago, on Friday, February the 14th, a dear colleague's threatening letter from the acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the United States Department of Education. In that letter, the author, Craig Trainer, referred to educational institutions that have toxically indoctrinated students with the false premise that the United States is built upon systemic and structural racism. In other words, no debate. It's simply described as false, and there is an explicit threat to withdraw funding from institutions that persist with teaching the idea of systemic and structural racism. One might ask why they are so afraid of these ideas. It seems that it is more obvious to them than perhaps it is to us what could happen if those ideas grow in popularity. We must find courage in their fear. But all of this suggests a different future for critical philosophy of race than the one I would have liked to have outlined. It seems we are entering into a war of ideas. I'm sure that's something that is spreading throughout the world as an already present in many places. But what I think we can say and must say is that whatever the immediate future of critical philosophy of race, it calls for international solidarity, such as we're experiencing it in this meeting between critical philosophy of race and critical philosophy of caste and race, that must engage us in the long term. Thank you very much.
And so we are deeply grateful to Robert for having so elegantly and so densely walked us through both the history of critical philosophy of race, or proto-critical philosophy of race, and its present and its future. And I'm reminded of a phrase that Robert had used in an interview a couple of years ago in the journal Philosophy World Democracy, where he said that there is a danger that today's anti-racism is fighting yesterday's racisms. And I think to do philosophy is certainly to be able to develop the eyes and ears to look into the future, which is the somber note on which Robert ended. But I think the more somber his observations were, the more they are inspired by a real desire and motivation to fight these newly developing racisms, which are perhaps also new forms of old racisms. So I invite questions. I request people to be brief so that we can have more questions, and we can maybe take a few at a time.
Thank you, Professor Bernasconi, for the very interesting and stimulating talk. I want to ask you about what you said regarding lived experiences. Particularly, you referred to Frantz Fanon's discussion of the Black experience, and also the importance of experience to uh, understanding race theory, or even in maybe combating racism. And when we discourse or address the problems of race or racism, um, or even casteism or any other forms of inequality, lived experience is often given a certain sense of primacy. You know, the question of what do you know? What do you know if you haven't experienced it? So I was wondering if you would suggest an alternative to lived experiences, perhaps maybe some other knowledges, or something that is different from experience as such, that might add to the conversation of race theory as well as in addressing systemic racism.
Thank you. There was a slight echo and I wasn't able to capture all that you said, but I think I have the gist of the question. The idea that Fanon presents in Black Skin and White Masks is that lived experience is indispensable, but that lived experience only comes to fully understand itself when it understands what the experience is rooted in. And it's only when one understands what the lived experience is rooted in, the structures, the cultural imposition, that one can directly seek to bring about the change that Fanon wants. And Sartre, in Critique of Dialectical Reason and Search for a Method, takes up a similar idea. For these philosophers, what is important to understand is the concrete. But the concrete, in order to be rendered intelligible, cannot be taken in the abstract. If one just abstracts one's experience from the context which shaped it, one is not going to fully understand what happened to you. And so what they're saying is you begin from a particular, could be a particular historical event, or it could be a lived experience. And one tries to give one's best description of that lived experience. And this is what so many writers have done, not just philosophers, but also novelists, and one sees it as a form, media forms. But one has to then show how that experience was shaped. And it's there that one goes back into history. This is what Sartre calls the regressive movement. And as one goes back into history, one broadens out one's perspective to see what shaped these events in the world, in the way the world is structured, in the distribution of wealth, resources, opportunities, and so on. And yet, though that regressive history must be guided by a progressive impulse, the belief in a future humanity where there will be equality, because that's why we're engaged in what we're doing, genuine equality. And so by placing the lived experience or the particular historical event within the progressive, regressive movement, a dialectical account, as Sartre would call it, then and only then does the account of the lived experience become concrete, because it's no longer been abstracted from all those forces that shaped it, and instead is located within a conception of history which is moving towards a better future. And so that is the role of lived experience as these philosophers think it. And that shows, I think, the way that an account of systemic racism has to include and take its starting point either from a historical event, a singular historical event, or a lived experience. It's interesting that, and surprising perhaps, Sartre did not embrace the idea of lived experience. You would think of it as quintessentially existentialist, but he did not embrace it until 1957 in Search for a Method. And while I don't think he got it from Fanon, it's really interesting that because they had the same aim to render intelligible the system, they found themselves drawing on the same resources in a similar way.
I think we have time for one more.
It's a little unclear.
Now, is it better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, I'm Meena Dhanda. I do not know if you recall me. We were in the same panel in 2015 in London, Critical Philosophy of Race Conference, which was organized by Nathaniel Tobias Coleman. And I spoke on our fight at the time to get caste included in the Equality Act UK as an aspect of race. So our attempt to bring together these two struggles against casteism and against racism go quite a long way. And I think before that, in 2012, actually, I didn't share this with colleagues in the morning when I gave my keynote, that Ashwini Deshpande, Nathaniel, and I had written a project for a US, UK, India, UKRE project on caste and race, which we didn't get funding for obvious reasons that from India, we were never hopeful that we would get that funding. So that's how long we've been waiting for an opportunity to bring together this research, and it's really fantastic that this conference, preceded by the one that happened last year, is now on that track. I wanted to ask you about drawing on your comment you made about critical race theories, location within legal studies, and the comment that I agree with, that measures to use legal means are restricted to local jurisdictions. But our experience of trying to get caste included in various equality or DEI policies or equality acts across the globe has been that we have benefited enormously from exchanging between us what each of us has been doing. So in Australia, when the anti-racist framework was being designed, I, in the UK, contributed to their group there. They are still at a very different stage than where we were and where we are in the United States. Likewise, say Professor Kevin Brown in the US, and has formed a group of people with lawyers from UK, from everywhere, who are discussing the local conditions within which we can try and move. The important thing about this is, even though the actual measures have to be concrete and located and suited to the local conditions, the way in which we meet opposition to those measures is quite alike, I think, because the global attempt to squash discussion of racism or caste or race is very similar. In fact, the same people do it. So the person in the UK who was responsible in spearheading the attack against including caste as an aspect of race, traveled to the USA and lived for 2 weeks in California at the point, this is by his own admission, no detective work by us. He went online and he said this is what he's done. He sat there for 2 weeks, so even though there was a vote in California to pass to include caste within the protected characteristics, it was the governor's decision to not include it. And in order to lobby that governor, this person from the UK was sitting there for 2 weeks, ensuring, and they would be doing all kinds of meetings and whatnot. So we have an opposition which I think is globally quite well coordinated. So from our point of view, even though we are in different disciplines maybe, but as academic activists, whatever you want to call us, we need to also, I think, be coordinated in that way. So from that point, I want to say that I sometimes feel that philosophy, philosophers, and I would say even critical philosophy phrase, philosophy, has not worked alongside activists in other disciplines. And I think that even though our styles may be different, but as I'm repeating myself, but simply as people similarly facing opposition, we have enough in common to sit on the same table. So I wonder what you think about that. Sorry, my voice is going a bit, so yeah.
Well, I wish I was there to be able to continue this conversation with you in person, but it was just impossible for me to travel to India at this time, in spite of Divya's encouragement. I mean, I agree with everything you say, including the sense in which philosophers have often fallen short. I think you have to sort of, it goes back a long way. There's an important book by John McCumber, that I forget the title exactly, but it described how the transformation of philosophy that took place in the United States, which of course dominates a lot of the philosophical discussion, not just in its own country, but also in large parts of Europe and so on. As a result of McCarthyism, drew back from political engagement, and it has never recovered that. And it has developed styles of thinking which allow it to do that, and yet still think that it's accomplishing valuable philosophical work, which it may or may not be doing. So I entirely agree that philosophers have a lot to answer for in their failure to address some of these issues. But when I look at some philosophers, and I go to these big conferences, I'm not sure these are the people I want addressing these political issues, because they're so far distant from the real suffering of oppressed peoples. I think that what you say about addressing local conditions is very important. And I think what you said, what really struck me in your comments was how you were referencing different countries and showing that these struggles gain energy and force insofar as these different struggles come together and unite. And I think in this particular time, which is such a depressing time, these are, to use a phrase of T.S. Eliot, says, unpropitious times. These are unpropitious times for philosophy suddenly to do what it hasn't been doing. And yet, I think that one of the things that strikes me is how it is often easier to see oppression, racism, casteism, and so on in contexts other than one's own. That one is brought up to accept certain ways of doing things, the ways that are familiar, the ways that we're comfortable in. This is certainly part of my own story, that I was, and Divya alluded to it, that I was woken from my dogmatic slumbers by going to Memphis. So, I mean, I think that this international aspect is what is going to be so important as we try to face the what seems to be an international movement to suppress these, I wouldn't even call them radical ideas, to oppress these movements towards justice.
Hello. Am I audible to you? Professor Bernasconi, thank you very much for bringing Sartre and Fanon, and also tracing their earlier disagreement and maybe coming together by the time of The Wretched of the Earth. In his introduction, Sartre says, in a certain sense, when Fanon has a certain kind of disagreement with the Sartrean approach to the question of blackness or racism. But in the introduction, you find Sartre saying that you are what you are by the deep-seated and continuous refusal of what others have made of you in relation to a radical approach to racism and what you have there in Fanon. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for stressing the point that systemic racism cannot be understood or taken up in isolation without looking at questions of ableism, sexism, casteism, and many other things. So in this, the grand unifying narratives and the grand theories have been rejected, and we live in the times of a certain kind of neoliberal grand theory, where even with our lived experiences, we are not able to project a counter, a sufficient, meaningful enough counter to change and transform the lived reality of casteism, of racism. So what or why are we lacking in this? That's a, I'm not rephrasing, let's say, thesis 11 for you, but the point is, even when we realize that there is a grand overarching, neoliberal crony capitalism that allows this person from travel to UK and travel from UK to US and do the same campaign against inclusion of casteism as a concern. So in this context, where are we lacking in terms of shaping counter both for the activists who were immediately energized by Fanon and Sartre, and also the academics who are sitting here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's always difficult to tell people what they should do, and I'm not going to try. I'm going to say, though, that by the end of your question, by drawing it back to activism, you had really provided the answer in many ways. I think that one of the great energizing events for a lot of the younger people working in critical philosophy of race, people who are now my students or people who are their age or just a little older, was all the demonstrations that were going on in the United States around Black Lives Matter and such things, that the activism of those created by those events allowed people to see things differently and allowed them to see the inadequacies of the theories that they were being given and the conceptions of fairness, justice as fairness, or whatever it is, that is part of the dominant discourse. And I think that what I was sort of gesturing towards is that up until now, you could say, well, academics, certainly in the United States, I'm not going to speak about the situation in India or elsewhere, but academics, it was a question of whether they were going to move into a political arena away from a certain sort of, I wouldn't want to say ivory tower attitude, that's an exaggeration, but that they were, to some extent, living in a kind of isolation from the society and the political issues that were being faced by poor people. They were often, the academics are living in suburbs and of fancy houses and so on and so forth. I'm not immune from that. But I think what's happening is that the politics has now been brought into the universities. So the politics has come to meet us. We don't go out to meet the politics. The activism is going to be happening not necessarily by our choice, but it is going to be happening in the universities and the colleges, and the extent to which we allow ourselves to be intimidated by these orders and restrictions. And so we are moving into a new period. That's what I was suggesting in my talk. And I think that helps to give the answer to your question. It's whether we like it or not, we are now in a situation which we have no choice but to choose.
One last question.
Hi, Professor Bernasconi. This is Arushi. I wanted to ask you that, of course, critical philosophy of race has, and everybody who's followed in your footsteps has been on the project of deracializing philosophy. I wondered if you have any thoughts about how we could decastize the Indian classroom, what that would mean for academic and pedagogical practices, and had a quick follow-up question that, ever since we had the special issue, we've been doing a lot of comparative work across different castes and tribes in India. So I'm also wondering, is there a way of using critical philosophy of caste and race to build solidarities where comparisons are, between two entities do not completely overlap, their distinctions do remain, but how do we build a new language for solidarity in fighting, let's say, a common oppressor? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, I mean, obviously these are the important issues that each of us faces, and again, it's not my job to, you have people in the room who can speak much better than I can about what should be done to decolonize the Indian classroom. So I'm not going to suggest that, but I do think that it is bringing on the next generation of teachers. This has been, for me, such an important issue, and more important now than ever before. Whatever is happening now will not last. But the people have to be ready to fill the spaces once they reopen. And so efforts to ensure an education that prepares people to address these issues can be conducted in all sorts of different ways. And again, precisely through the international context. We need to have more dialogue, travel between different countries until we get banned from traveling. We need to, because the visitor can say, perhaps in some contexts, more than the local person can. We must study each other's forms of those forms of systemic oppression so that they can be used to instruct people about how systems operate, even where we're not allowed to talk about the particular location where we are, because students are smart enough to be able to draw their own sense of the parallels and so on. So again, I think it's not a question of lacking motivation. The motivation has been provided for even those people who I wasn't sure were allies. I've been having conversations, and I see some people who seem empowered by the new atmosphere in which a certain kind of racism is now more acceptable than before. But I also see people who I didn't think of as allies being willing to become allies, precisely because they now believe what we've been saying all this time. So I think, again, we just have to take our opportunities in the local situation, that every local situation is different, but we can draw strength from each other.
Okay. So with that, we are going to close this session. I would like to thank you again, Robert, for waking up very early in the morning to join us, simply because this year you couldn't come. So we are counting on you, and also Nancy to be here in person for further work, because I think you've outlined more work for us, both as philosophers and activists. It goes back to some of your early writings on Michael Dummett as well. I would like to thank the audience for the entire day, but also for this session, for the several questions, and questions which clearly show the commitment to addressing systemic racism in our own societies, but also each other's, which makes us truly global as acting agents in the world. And with that, I request that we give a big round of applause. And see you tomorrow at 9:45. We would like to do better time management tomorrow, so I hope we can all be seated and start off at 9:45 a.m. Thank you.